The Canadian Arts Network recognizes and pays respect to the original people of this land. For time immemorial, Indigenous peoples have cared for and stewarded the lands known to many as Canada so that each of us today can benefit from all the gifts the land provides. Out of respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate colonial histories and their present-day implications. We therefore work from the perspective of honoring, protecting, and sustaining the land and the people who were first on this territory to move beyond acknowledgement and into the doing. We recognize the impact of colonial history and structures on our own communities and extend a hand in partnership to those who wish to become an accomplice in dismantling them. My name is Sean C. I'm a father, artist, and community organizer based in Amiskwaci, Waskaekan, known as Edmonton, Treaty 6 Territory, and Métis Homeland. I've been working with Miranda Jimmy and Vicky Chow to produce these Canadian Arts Network virtual resources. Thanks to support from Canada Council for the Arts and Festival Access AZ, we've released a series of free artist workshops featuring talented speakers sharing experiences and tips for Asian Canadian artists. Now we're producing a series of roundtable discussions to bring together arts leaders to share learnings and ideas. Make sure to sign up at canadianarts.com to get links to all the online content. Thank you everyone for joining us live, and a warm welcome to our panelists, Kari Woo and Barbara Lee. Moderating today is Soni Dasmohapatra, who is an assistant professor in the Arts and Culture Management Department at MacEwan University. Soni has over 25 years of experience in sectors of academia, public service, nonprofit management, and international relations, and also has a consulting company. Her company focuses on co-creating innovative design solutions with clients to address gaps in organizations, individual journeys, and community well-being. I'll pass it to Soni now, who will talk more about the intention for today's roundtable and introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's my pleasure to be here and to share a panel with such powerful women such as Kari and Barbara. My pronouns are she and her, and I also am on Amiskwaciy, Treaty 6 Territory, Edmonton. And today you're in for a treat because we're going to be talking about advocating for yourself and your community. And before we begin, I just invite everyone to just arrive in this space. Maybe take a minute to sort of like ground your sitting bones, take a couple of deep breaths, and get ready for what we're going to set in terms of the recognition of the history of Asian Canadians in Canada and what this means for the past, to the present, for the future. So I'd like to start by just sharing a brief overview. So when we talk about Asia, because we're the Can Asia Network, Asia has over 50 countries. So to imagine a diversity of Asians in Canada is a feat in itself. It's very complex, it's very interesting, it's very wonderful to understand that diversity as well. And I think that we also need to understand the history in order to understand where we are today. So I'm going to share the story of a tale of three companies: the East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and the Hong Kong occupation of British. So all of these colonial efforts have been around for more than 400 years, and this is documented by the British Empire itself. So when we understand this context of colonialism, it's important for us to think back to this time and imagine what had happened to our ancestors, Indigenous people from Asia who are now in Canada. And what does this mean for advocacy and for community well-being and organizing? So today, when we look at a history of racism in Canada specifically, we can borrow on an example of restrictive legislation policy that happened in the early 1900s. Despite the fact that Chinese communities and South Asian communities were British citizens, they were denied citizenship because of legislation such as continuous journey legislation and Chinese head tax and Japanese internment, for as a few examples. And today we are celebrating 150 years of um, the Chinese Exclusion Act, sort of as an anniversary or a reckoning or a recognition of that. And same thing with the contingent legislation. The reason I share this is because it's important to understand how unconscious bias and systemic barriers are still ingrained in our legislative policies and the way that they impact communities who are from Asia specifically. And when we look forward to see how we understand this in the arts, culture, and heritage sector, there is still a lot of underrepresentation of diverse artists from Asian backgrounds in this sector, whether they be LGBTQS Asian, whether they be women, whether they be youth, whether they be men, um, or seniors. It's very generationally, it's been very difficult to occupy space in arts and culture sometimes. So to have this forum to discuss those challenges and to discuss the successes is really special and amazing. So thank you, Canadian Arts, for putting this together. So now, as we move into the panel, I will introduce the two panelists that we have here. So Kari Woo is a studio jeweler and interdisciplinary artist known for her notably understated and modern aesthetic. Her distinct lines of contemporary art jewellery aim to create meaningful objects through design and are distributed through Canada and beyond via direct sales, boutique gallery representation, and online. Woo's accomplished mixed media work focuses largely on issues of cultural identity and employ personal narratives as a vehicle to explore concepts of migration and identity, including memory, loss of language, appropriation, acculturation, notions of home, sense of belonging, and or disembodiment, as understood through diasporic experience and intergenerational trauma. Select works from this series are held in both private and provincial art collections. Other past works of hers range from installations, performances, and sculpture to interactive art, objects, and public art. Kari is a fine art school graduate, BFA honors, a former brick and mortar shop owner, a community organizer and collaborator, entrepreneur, avid gardener, aspiring culture, and proud homeschooling parent. Welcome, Kari. I'll introduce Barbara and then I'll get them to introduce themselves as well. Barbara Lee has spent over 25 years as a community advocate and organizer of events to increase opportunities for Canadian Asian artists in mainstream music, film, TV, and media. She is founder of the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, Canada's oldest Asian film festival, eliminatehate.org, and Racial Equity Screen Office, and the creator of East by Northwest Global Summit. RESO, or the Racial Equity Screen Office, led advocacy work for the Knowledge Network to complete its equity audit from fiscal years 2015-16 to 2021-2022, which resulted in mandated racial equity targets of 50% commission work from BIPOC creators. RESO also released National Film Board of Who's Canada Racial Equity Audit NFB Productions from 2012 to 2021 that has led to NFB's commitment for setting racial equity target commitments that by March 31st, 2025, over 30% of its productions and co-productions underway at that time will be directed by artists and filmmakers who self-identify as Black and people of color. This figure represents the minimum expected outcome as the NFB continues to evolve and adapt to Canadian society's dynamism and diversity. RESO's mandate includes bringing Canada's diaspora stories to the world. Barbara is also a writer and independent filmmaker and has worked as a broadcast journalist, receiving the National Radio and Television News Directors Association Award for Best Editorial in 1998. Her film, Between the Laughter, was one of the National Film Board's Real Diversity 2004 winners, which aired on CBC and PBS Northwest. She's currently finishing her personal music documentary, Sing My Song, and her horror script. So with that illustrious introduction, Kari, would you like to add anything else before we start about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I'd just like to say that I'm really happy to be here. And also that I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in a traditional Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta, the territory of the Nakota Nations, Bearspaw, Goodstoney, Chiniki, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, Siksika, and Kainai, and the Tsuut'ina, part of the Dene people, as well as the Métis Region 3.
Thank you, Kari. Barbara?
Thank you for the introduction, Soni, and thank you, Can Asian Arts Network, for hosting this. I also like to recognize and acknowledge that I am coming from the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations, which is also known as Vancouver. So thank you for having us, and that I'd like to acknowledge that we are fortunate and grateful to be on these unceded territories of the Indigenous First Nations, the Métis people.
Thank you so much. So let us start. So I'd like to start by asking a question. Either one of you can respond. How do you define advocacy?
Very difficult. Advocacy is very personal. I would say advocacy is a spectrum, it's a continuum. And it depends on what I always talk about is where people start in their advocacy journey is very different. Just speaking up and speaking out is the first step. Seeing something that is unfair, or not right, recognizing it has been difficult for many just because of the internalized racism that we've learned, and now you're in the process of unlearning, and where you are in that journey would define what advocacy means to individuals. But I say for myself, it's advocacy for me is action and implementation and material change, making material change. And that when you read about what we did with National Film Board and also with the Knowledge Network, that is advocacy work at its I guess at its most prominent.
Thank you. Kari?
Let's see, I would say that advocacy for me, honestly, I mean, when I started on my artistic journey, I didn't necessarily mean to become an advocate, but I think being in the arts where, in a society where the arts is underfunded, being a woman of color, and then the context of my work, because I've been speaking to cultural identity, and uncovering lots of, personal stories, which I've also become to realize are broader than just my story. They're stories of community and culture. I think the advocacy work that I've done is just in discovering those stories and sharing them. And then through those conversations, there's been connection, which builds community, and then through the community, maybe there's action that can happen. And ultimately, I mean, I would hope that advocacy work can eventually lead to, at some point, policy change, because that's where a lot of difference can be made, in a place where we're governed by rules and law and the state. So I think that's probably where I sit with it. So I'm kind of not an unwilling advocate, but I didn't totally mean to, as I think the two of you were very intent on that kind of work. But I'm happy for it, and certainly the connections I've made through that work have been such meaningful relationships.
I love those answers. I think it's so true. Like, where you situate yourself and locate yourself is how you respond to that system that needs that advocacy, right? So Barbara, within the context of film and television, Kari, within your context as a practicing artist, myself in academia and public policy, it's so important to understand that ecosystem and see who your allies are, who the players are, and how you sort of move into that transformative change. That's beautiful. And in terms of community, like, how do you, like, what is community to you? Like, what are the essential pieces that you think create this community that you work with and maybe move in and out of? I'm not sure.
I think for myself, I mean, there's a few communities that I move in and out of, and certainly kind of sitting in this circle with you good women today, and the folks that have joined us. It's a new community in a way for me, because I have always, I wouldn't say been isolated, but I kind of was more active in the general arts community. You know, I'm in the fine craft sector, being a jewelry maker. And so I've always advocated for, you know, the education and access to my friends and my colleagues' work to the right audience members, I suppose. Also, you know, I've advocated for access for artists to be able to exhibit their work without, you know, because there's lots of, I guess, fences or barriers to being able to do that. So yeah, community, it can be based on interest. I mean, it can also be based on conflict, and that's the reason we come together too, right? So, but I think I'm going around about, but the essential definition for me of community is a group of people who have shared values. Yeah.
I would say when I first started the Vancouver Asian Film Festival 27 years ago, there was not an Asian filmmaking community. And when I mean filmmaking, I mean anything to do with screen content. There were people doing their own, you know, doing projects here and there, but there was nothing that galvanized and brought people together to share their experiences. And that was something, it was creating a space. So community is a shared space that, you know, and as Kari said, of people coming together with shared values, or maybe there's a conflict that people want to discuss, something that that's important to people. There's a feeling that there's something that's missing or needed, a way to come together and share and connect. I think as humans, we have this natural instinct to want to connect to others for many reasons. And for us, VAF's core belief is that representation matters. Before it became a catchphrase, it was we needed to see ourselves in front of the cameras and have the power to create content behind the scenes so that it can be projected onto these screens that were authentic and non-stereotypical, which was what we were seeing, you know, at that time. Basically, that's all we were seeing was stereotypical images. And so the community, it wasn't an easy, it was a slow process, getting the word out. It was, you know, prior to internet and social media. So it was really a lot of word of mouth, going in person to different groups and just saying, we're creating a space. Come check us out. And within the community, the space that we created, there were other sub-communities. So it's just, a community is not a catch-all. People can find their own special communities within a community too. It's just I see it as coming together with very like-minded ideas or visions, or it could be temporary, it could be permanent, it can be what you need at the time you need it.
I love that fluidity. It's so true. Like just coming in and out, established for a long time or not. I really like how you've all shared the values and the purpose and the goals of coming together and what that can mean for mental health, for belonging, for inclusion, right? And I think that just to take a little bit of a turn, like all of us are talking about, I loved your bio, Kari, where you're talking about somatics, intergenerational trauma, erasure, like all of these pieces that we are facing as diasporic Asians in different ways and contexts in Canada. So having this sense of community is so important to just sort of like have the lifeline to create and express and evolve into what we are becoming, right? And I would love to hear what you have done to sort of build that identity piece out as well as women who are Asian in the Canadian context to support that community infrastructure.
Who wants to come in first? I think I would like to also add to the community piece too. I think in terms of community, I like to see, and I think there's a place for everybody, like people from all different ages and life experiences, inside a community. I think when you have a almost like homogenous group of like age group or, philosophical thought, school of thought, I'm not sure that that's a really great rounded community. There's got to be some kind of inclusivity and access. But in terms of advocating for women, I think, again, like this work that I embarked on, and it really was not by accident, but it was a way to kind of process some events that were happening in my family when I was a student, the death of a grandmother and lots of the questions that couldn't be answered with her passing because, she didn't talk about things. Plus there was a barrier language, I don't speak Chinese. And she didn't speak, well, she could understand English, but she wouldn't speak it. And so these works started as a way for me to process and lament, the loss of these stories. But in creating these pieces, which were mostly based on photographs, because photographs can tell their own stories, like I said earlier, kind of these stories came out and then it drew people in, or it created these conversations that I wouldn't have had with these people if it had not been for these pieces. And maybe people were interested in my story, but not really. It was just kind of a catalyst for sharing stories. And so I think that really encouraged me to keep doing that work, and different from my jewelry work, this work is very non-commercial. And so I feel like a real community has been created through that work and the conversations that have come about from that. And so I think, in Asian culture, I think sometimes, well, often, we're quite, it's like that model minority thing or we don't share the suffering or, the stoicness of, I know my grandparents or parents in terms of their life experiences aren't shared. And so talking about these things now has emboldened myself to continue to do this work, but I also can see that it's bringing stories out. And then I, have met a whole circle of people who are telling their own stories in their own ways, whether they're writing or musicians or, the work that either one of you or anybody in this chat is participating in. And so I guess for myself, that's, I think just being out here and then recently I participated in a Alberta Foundation for the Arts, like small production about talking about how they're diversifying the collection. And so, some of my works were collected there a few years ago. And so I feel really proud that the stories of my community are being represented in a provincial kind of art collection. And so I hope that encourages other artists to continue in the work that they're doing. Yeah.
Was there a question for me about sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I guess locating ourselves as Asian women who are in our sector, for yours is film, for example, how do you negotiate, that identity, that space and place that you want to create for advocacy and community?
I would say that the space that we create is really about storytelling, and Kari talked about this. The storytelling is always the first and foremost. It's how we connect to each other. It's how we build community. It's how we, and I don't mean, and it's cross different communities. I see it as an intergenerational. I spend a lot of time talking to my kids, telling them stories. That's the best way I feel that I can teach them anything, is to tell them a story. They seem to be, engaged. People are engaged more. And so that's something that, and women, I find women are often the storytellers. They're the holders of oral histories when, I don't want to call it gossip, but in those moments where women come together, they're doing the work that they've been doing, they just talk, the aunties, the sisters, and that's how a lot of information is being carried forward. So I would say that in creating those spaces where it's safe to have these conversations, where you don't have to explain, everyone in that space, just there's an understanding and nuance of what the, cultural sensitivities are without having to explain it. And it's exhausting sometimes to explain. You're just in a space and you're just you talking about anything or everything without having to give all the subtext needed. So those are rare spaces. I've been in many where I am the lone voice of color, especially, and the lone woman of color in a space that is been mainly white males, and where you speak up and it's you're patronized for it, or B, you're just ignored until somebody else champions you, is an ally who is usually a white male before you get any recognition. So I think for women, that's something that we really encourage and teach. We believe that it's a muscle memory, meaning that you have to practice it for that muscle to develop, and you have to give lots of opportunities. And so we do a lot of opportunities. A lot of our, the majority of our executives and our leaders in Bath and Riesel are women of color. We're making these spaces, giving them opportunities to develop that muscle memory, and then to think in ways that are calling out, but also calling in.
Beautiful. I love that. I think it's so important, like you said, to have leadership spaces carved out and created for that advocacy and transformative change to happen. Otherwise, it won't happen. So being intentional is so important. So I love that you brought that up. As a segue, I'll just share a little bit of the work that I'm doing that sort of complements what you all are doing. So most recently, the City of Edmonton Archives, which we know archives are very colonial. You have to have a very certain process of how you document, of how you record, um, hired a community archivist, Jaja, who is of Chinese origin, and she has struck together three different committees, one for the LGBTQS community in Edmonton, because they're actually the first ones that started that sort of archival piece and advocated for this position to come about. And then she started Chinese history, like archival piece, and a South Asian one, right? So I'm part of the South Asian one we just started. And what's shocking to me is like in the archives, I'm not talking about web life, but in the city archives, if you fast forwarded in a time machine and you came back to 2023, you would never know the diversity of Edmonton. You would never know that the South Asian and the Chinese population, the Filipino population are some of the biggest Asian communities that are creating art, creating economics, driving different spaces and places in terms of politics and ways of being, right? So I was like, oh my God, that's so crazy. Like, it's totally erased, right? Like, we don't exist, right? I mean, maybe in terms of digital, we might, but so to me, that was really shocking. And every time I ask somebody, do you know when the first South Asian was in Edmonton or Calgary, nobody ever suspects the early 1900s. They always say the 60s or the 70s. After that, migration was open because all the discrimination, immigration policies were opened, right? So to me, being part of this archive committee is an opportunity to actually revisit how do we document oral histories? Because like both of you have said, sometimes when you are in a space where you have to adhere to certain rules and restrictions, and like you said, Barbara, you can't be your authentic self. You can't share that story that is a legacy story of a community that has established their roots for over 100 years in a city like Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, right? So for me, this is really important to keep alive so that my great grandkids, when they go to the archives, they'll be like, hey, I know that person, right? But it takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of resistance because the archival community is not ready to disrupt the way that they do things, right? So I think for me too, it's just like, how do we keep pushing in a way that's gentle but firm and able to introduce these other ways of capturing stories and capturing history and capturing um, not white voices, right? Because one of the things that I also do is I really look at sort of white supremacy body. Resma Menakin has written about this extensively in the States. A lot of people here, Gabor Mate, like we all carry the white supremacy body. Like you said earlier, there's this shame, there's this internal racism. So how do we unpack that and then challenge others to start unpacking that to understand the diversity of our communities, of any community, right? Because it's important for that. So that leads into my next question around community care, because I think that the trauma that we all experience in different moments, in different ways, just by being present in this current state of whatever the world is, it's really difficult sometimes, I think, to be okay, to be no stable or whatever that means. I don't know what stable means, but to be okay with that force of toxicity or the trauma culture that Gabor Mate talks about his book in The Myth of Normal, right? So how is it that we create community care and also individual care so that we are, we're not surviving, but we're thriving and we're having these moments of rest and joy and celebration.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's a lot. It's a lot of thinking about this. I always go back to what I tell my kids. Life is hard. Life is hard. You'll always face challenge. And as a racialized person and as a woman, it's just an extra layer, a couple layers on top of that, right? So sometimes in the advocacy work, sometimes you have to be loud and not gentle. And sometimes you need to be gentle or else what you're saying is not going to be heard. So it's a little bit of I always find it's sort of a push pull. It's an art, not a science, advocacy. It's really about reading the people that you're talking to, know when to be hard, know when to pull back, know when to call in, know when to call out, know when to offer something, know when to take something. Like it's really, it's a process. And I would tell people that it's not perfect. No one's perfect at it, but you got to try. The advocacy is in the trying, is in the speaking, is in the sharing. And it's really important right now. And I know you might ask this question later, but right now, as the ebb and flow of advocacy is on a sort of a waning, it's more important to keep those embers glowing. They don't have to be ablaze right now, but you can't let those embers die out. And I would say that the advocacy work and what we're doing, it's hard. It's emotional labor. And I think it was Joel DeFuentes said this, is that advocacy work is like a choir singing. And I love this, and I don't want to take, everybody should be singing. And if you have a whole choir singing, there can people who can stop and take a breath, and the note will still continue because others are carrying on that note. And when you're ready, then you can start, and everybody will take turns taking a breath. And that's what I think advocacy has to be. It has to be a choir of many voices singing and allowing space for others to take breaths in between.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, that's like we're stronger together, right? And I think that's something that I'm just so appreciative of, because for a long time I felt so isolated, and then when I started sharing the story and connecting with people over the stories and becoming a part of this broader network of narrative that, I can see is very specific to, an immigrant kind of experience and non-white bodies, it was amazing to me that just the openness that people share these stories with. And it was comforting. So when you're asking about, Soni, about community care, I actually had this recent experience. It was I was part of a project run by playwright here in Calgary, Dale Kwong, and she had gotten some funding to do some interviews with community members, mostly elders, who had stories, maybe lived memories, but at least stories of impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the head tax, on the families. And with number one, it was difficult to find people who wanted to talk about their stories, particularly from the older generations. And there were, I can't remember how many of us artists there were. It might have been 7. It could have been more than that. We were just there to witness these stories, and that there might be production, like a production piece of the project that happens next. But this project was just about witnessing these stories. But every day we would gather, and it was so amazing because Dale asked everybody, what's your access today? And so, and I didn't really understand what that was at the moment, but some people were like, I'm really tired today, so I might be quiet, or I'm really stressed out because somebody in my family's not feeling well. And so just to have that kind of, number one, to feel safe enough to share those things, but number two, to slow down enough to honor those things for each other, and just have some space for people to be how they need to be, because we are all kind of trying to, I think, dissect all the things that influence, how the world is around us, right, and how our place in it. And the dialogue now, compared to when I started making my work 25 years ago, or perhaps when you started the film festival, the dialogue and the language around these issues is just so much broader, and it's brilliant, and it's really helping to frame a lot of the work that I've done, because these conversations weren't happening before, particularly not in this broader context. So I think that in itself is, a real aspect of community care, and being vulnerable enough to share it. But as long as you're kind of in a safe space. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally echoes with me too. You're right. When I started 25 years ago, it was a different type of conversation. It was a different context. It was a different people at the table, right? And while we've progressed, you're right, so many different things have happened to open up more spaces for storytelling, dialogue, for representation. But at the same token, I feel like there's so much more polarization because of global impacts and what is happening in Canada itself, right? And I love what you said, Barbara, about advocacy. That's so beautiful, the choir metaphor. And also, like, I think that what what I'm challenged with is this whole context of equity, diversity, inclusion work being in a linear logic model with outcomes and measurements and data in a very traditional, like Eurocentric way of collecting and extracting things to show something that is performative, right? Because I feel like those things are not linear. They're circular. They're like connected. They're relational. They're ways that we move together, embody each other and ourselves to create diverse voices and diverse experiences. That is the basis for what we all represent as well, right? But when you try to stick the square peg in the circle hole continuously, you keep failing, right? There's this circle of failure that the system is telling you. But then individually, your beauty of your art is just showcasing itself, right? Like in the community and how you connect with people, I think. So there's a disconnect sometimes, right? And I like to call this ecosystem in self and self in ecosystem, because you're playing with that, like dancing with that, like Barbara suggested earlier. So how do you balance that? Because I think, like, we've talked a little bit about it, but like it's exhausting, the emotional labor, the way that you have to show up, the way that you have to like you said, be vulnerable, but know that it's good space if that community care framework is there to support you and bring you up and not bring you down, right? But like, is there a balance, or is it just go for it? I don't know what you think.
I'm currently, you may have noticed my voice is a little strange. Neither of you have met me before, so you wouldn't know the difference. But those people that are listening to the chat, I'm just recovering from a thyroid surgery. And certainly this condition that happened wasn't created by stress, but I don't think the level of stress that I live under as an independent artist, entrepreneur, has helped my health. And so it's really made me take a step back and look at a lot of these things, and a little bit deeper into like that intergenerational trauma piece, and just like kind of peeling back the layers a little bit more. But anyways, in this journey of recovery, some friends recommended books, podcasts, etc. And one of the books, you may have heard of it, that I'm listening to in Audibles right now is called Rest is Resistance. Just need to, yes, okay, right, by Trisha Hershey, and who I guess also is the originator of the Nap Ministry, if anybody knows that account on Instagram. And I just think that's amazing because, I think as people like descendants of immigrants, that were probably, that absolutely were marginalized and, not treated poorly, at some point in time. And, maybe people in the audience and, for myself or yourselves have had that experience yourselves, that you take that in, or, and if you haven't had it personally, like that trauma is in your family kind of lineage. And so I think the rest piece it is really resistance. And, we live in this Western culture, it's all about productivity. And I mean, that's a whole colonial construct too, right? Like productivity, economics, like the whole thing. And so I've been trying, dissecting that stuff and the way that I participate in it. And, I mean, we're all kind of, I don't want to use the word victim, but we are, victim to that. And it took a long time for me to realize it's like, what am I trying to prove? Who am I trying to prove this to? I mean, partially my dad, because he was always expecting me to be working. And even when I'm not working, I actually, when my dad calls, I tell him I'm working, even if I'm not, because that just makes him happy to hear that. Right. But, it's like, I think it's been good to take a step back and really reassess that. So, but it's hard, right? Because we got bills to pay, inflation's happening, like, being in the art sectors or, the academic sector, it's like, we're not killing it on the financial scene, right? But anyways, I don't know if I've answered the question, but that's what I have.
I was listening to that and just thinking about all the things that we do, and in this moment, rest is something I don't feel like I've had in the last 3 years, because the urgency of this moment in time and the window that is open, and that I don't know if it's closing, but for this brief moment, I feel like the ears and the eyes and the heart is more open than it's ever been. At the same time, it's trending the other way where it will be the opposite. So it's been the most open and the most closed at the same time, if that makes sense. And I'm concerned that the powers that be, there's a shift, and therefore there's no rest. And I understand the whole health thing too. There are times where I'm just exhausted. But you ask yourself, who's going to do this work, right? There is decades of muscle memory and relationships, because a lot of this work is around relationships. Is relational work. And so for part of the Racial Equity Screen Office that was launched in 2021, a lot of it was building those relationships back east in Toronto, where sort of the center of influences are. And that takes a lot of time. It's not the first time you meet them. I've been on Zooms every 2 to 3 times a week for the last 3 years, just because you need to be out there. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just that there needs to be rest. I agree. I mean, everybody I've talked to is feeling burnt out. There's a sense of burning out. There's a sense of, did we take 2 steps forward and we're taking 1 step back? How to regroup and how to move forward. I think that the point I would want to make about, if we're going back to this advocacy work, is the relationship, you need to bring in new people and new voices. Part of the work that I do is always about who else is coming. It can't be the same people, because they will be burnt out. So it's always about, how do you engage new people, different people? How do you connect? How do you in order for it to survive and thrive, it must be a continuum. And so like tomorrow I'm going to UBC. I'm going to go talk to students who is the future, and I'm trying to activate them. So every year I go and do 2 or 3 guest lectures at universities, and I'm hoping that in each one there will be one activation, one person activated. And that's all it needs. You don't need a lot, but you need to have one who will step up, and then you mentor. Mentorship is really important. Yeah, mentorship, knowledge sharing, and introducing them to everybody that you've met, and not, I've been in spaces where people are not willing to share their networks, but you can't. In this work, you cannot.
Yeah, that totally resonates with me. I love that you both shared this. Just building on your point, Barbara, I feel like as a professor, assistant professor, somebody said a couple of weeks ago that once this cohort of students will leave the industry, academia, and go into the industry, they will set the new course of this new form of artistry, of arts management, of policy change that is going to take and evolve. So I love that you're thinking in that future foresight way, because you're right, it's true. And even in the context of, like, you're right, like mentorships or networking opportunities, there's so many different ways that you can do that without it being exhausting, I think, right? So what are those models that are there that are simple, just to have that connection going for that change to happen? You're right, that advocacy is a different type. Like, it's a knowledge sharing, like you said, mentorship, but it's also like learning from the past generation to the present to the future, right? Since we're talking about books, oh my God, okay. So there's this amazing book called Real Self Care by Pooja Lakshman, and she named it A Transformative Program for Redefining Wellness, Crystal Cleanses and Bubble Baths Not Included. So I'm obsessed with this because she actually joined a cult after leaving medical school. And then she came back to, yeah, she came back to psychiatry, and it's such a beautiful book because she's like really, like, I really resonate with her because she's South Asian woman, grew up in the States, similar experiences, but she did all the things that she's not supposed to do as a brown girl, right? So what you were saying, Carrie, is like, when my dad calls, I'm telling him I'm working, because I think there's like this Asian girl thing happening with our parents, and how do we be in the world, right? So she's really great, and she offers really concrete activities and exercises about setting boundaries, about being strategic, about how is it that we want to take care of ourselves and our communities. And I love this book. I highly recommend it to everyone because she actually gives you concrete ways to practice this. So not we're not just saying it, but we're actually having a practice and seeing what works and what doesn't, like experimentation wise. Yeah, so I think that this has been such an amazing opportunity for us to share these thoughts. I feel like as we look to the future, I'll ask the last question. Um, like, what do you hope for advocacy as we move into the next 5 years, let's say? Because I think that there's like you said, it's hit or miss, right? It's like 5 steps forward, 2 steps back. My dad uses this analogy. He's an engineer, right? Like a bridge engineer. So when I decided to go into this career of activism and social sciences and arts, he's like, okay, do what you love. I support you. I'm like, okay, that's good. He's like, but remember, he's like, I have a blueprint. So I start and I finish and then I see the bridge. And he's like, you're not gonna have any indicators, you're not gonna have anything. He's like, you're just gonna be on an emotional roller coaster. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I'm like, oh my God, now in retrospect, I'm like, he's so right, right? Because you never know what you're gonna hit, right? If you're gonna touch that politician who's gonna speak up for you, if you're gonna connect with that young person who becomes a CEO of an arts company. Like, you never know. Like, I think that's the beauty of advocacy and of community and of understanding the complexity of the world that we live in and how things happen and how things change, right? So yeah, so for me, I feel like the advocacy path will never fail because I'm always the eternal advocate, and I really attribute it to my ancestors. Um, my grandparents were freedom fighters against the British Empire. My grandmother was 4'9", wore a sari, shot a rifle, joined the Gandhian movement. So I feel like sometimes she speaks through me, and I'm like, listen, this injustice cannot. So I feel like that's a piece. And even when I look at my kids and how they're also standing up for themselves in different ways about what they believe in, what they value, it's really inspiring to see that as well as a generational piece. So I'm hoping that as we move through this time, they also have the space in place to speak out and be confident and not be shut down. That's my hope.
Mhm, mhm. Well,
I
Barbara, oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I agree with you, but I've been fortunate enough to see some of the work. It hasn't been fast. It's not like a blueprint, 3 years, building's done. One of the programs that I co-founded was the Mighty Asian Movie Making Marathon. It's a 10-day competition to build a film so that filmmakers will have their calling card, will have something that they can apply for grants with. And every year, just seeing filmmakers come together, creating this safe space, a racialized set that they can work on and learn about the screen industry. And then the films that they produce has just gotten better and better. And we're in our 18th year. We just had our 18th edition, and
Wow.
the level of filmmaking and storytelling was phenomenal. I was so impressed. So yes, it's a long road, but there are small incremental changes, and you have to celebrate those, you know, and not get and that's why I always tell people, by the time that before a festival starts, I'm exhausted. I don't know why I'm doing this. And then 4 days later, after I've done it, I'm like, this is why I'm doing it, and it energizes me for the next year. So I don't know, maybe I don't know, I like the punishment of the whole year for 4 days of celebration, but yes.
You have a vision. I mean, I think that's part of it too, is maybe. Well, I think having a vision is a really important part of it, though, too, right? I mean, a vision for the future, right? And Barbara, you'd mentioned mentorship, and that's a huge part, right? Because, like, we're not going to be around forever, right? So it's like, maybe it's not necessarily handing off the torch, but it's like a collaborative thing, right? And like you had said earlier, sometimes people don't share contacts or networks or that, and it's like there's really no room for that if we're trying to better the place for our children and for our colleagues and friends and family and community. And so I think mentorship is huge, inspiring, younger people to get on board. I mean, I think there is the fact that we can speak about these things more openly is huge. I know for my son, like, he's curious, and I really try hard to not try to ingrain any of my bias. I try to be really objective about things for him. And I mean, one of the earliest places that I learned about racism was honestly in my own family, like, with my parents kind of indicating to me that I was different. And so then that kind of gave me a different way of being in the world. And so really try to not do that necessarily. My son's only 12 at this point, but just to let him discover who he is for himself, and then those questions of identity and race and all that, I mean, it'll come, but I'm not trying to define it for him. And so but also I think the collaboration and listening to others that have come before us too, so kind of carrying on that lineage. But rest is important too. So I hope you get some, Barbara.
I'm trying.
Yeah.
I love this model. Like, the Future of Good in Toronto, they were showcasing some really interesting social enterprise projects. And there's this one woman, I can't remember her name, but she actually created a rest retreat for activists. And I was like, oh my God, that's beautiful. Like they're just
Wow.
go and rest, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like that piece that you're saying about burnout and about, where do we find that in our own spaces to be supported and to go do that, right? I think it's really important. I love that we talked about this today. Yeah, so it's 7 o'clock in Alberta. So I just think that now we'll just wrap up. So I'm gonna ask to see, is there anybody that has a question that wants to pop into the chat or the Q&A box of our panelists? I'll give it 2 minutes.
Can I add something? I just wanted to, for all those people who might be coming to this or looking at this webinar and saying advocacy, what does that mean? I want to encourage people that supporting artists of color is advocacy. Using your consumer dollars and just showing up is advocacy. It may be small, but it's an important step. And I cannot impress upon anybody more than that showing up is the first step, and we all need to do it. And that is an important step of advocacy. And a lot of people think it's this big, giant, immensely giant, burden, not burden, but just work. And that they see all these people out there and they're like, I can't do that. I can't be that person who's out there speaking and doing that. And my call to action, because I always end every panel with a call to action. And my call to action to everyone who listens or is on this or is talking to somebody else, please share with them that showing up and supporting an artist by buying a ticket is really, really important. And that is a very important piece of advocacy.
That's wonderful. A note to end on, and it really goes with your analogy of the choir. Like there's so many voices, but also there's like the small and quiet voices, and then the loud and lead voices, and everything in between. And those people are so important, right, to kind of the fabric of this advocacy work. I totally agree. And so yeah, if you're not the person with the loud voice, maybe you bring that person cookies, or whatever that is. Like I think that it all makes a difference, right? And that's the community building piece too, right? So that we all do have a different role to play. Yeah.
And I love cookies. So.
I'll remember that when I come to Vancouver and see you.
Yeah, I'll bring you crumble cookies from Edmonton. They're so divine. We do have a question actually. So I'd be interested to hear more about how the financing of advocacy work fits in, if any. Is there money to do this very labor-intensive work? And if so, what would be the most basic things to start with?
I would say no, there is no money. The first thing I would say is no, there's no money. But advocacy doesn't often have to have money. A lot of these events are free, so showing up is free. Connecting with somebody else who, through conversation and finding where there's an intersectionality of what you're wanting to do. I mean, there is funding, but in order to get certain fundings, you have to sometimes have, it's a colonial, structure where you have to have a track record, or you have to be partnered up with an organization that has a track record, because often the monies that are available are public money, and they have to report back to government and people. There's foundations that you can write to. The funding piece is a full-time job. Often, like we have to hire somebody and then you have to speak the language of the funding agencies, which we have not been great at, because the way we talk about the work that we do is completely beyond some of the jurors and the people who are unfamiliar with the work that we do and the communities that we do the work for. So I would say if it's something you can do, there are all kinds of advocacy organizations out there. Find one that you're aligned with, and then work through that. I don't want to discourage people from starting their own advocacy group, but often you will have more success or more, you can do more if you find a group that's already in existence. I find a lot of people, they have an idea, they just want to start something, they want to do it because they want to do it their way, but you're going to be exhausted. You're exhausting your energy building something that may already exist somewhere else, and it's just a matter of working together with somebody. So that's what I would say about the whole funding piece. Try to make it maximize your effort in achieving what you want to achieve, and that may not be starting your own thing, but looking for organizations that are aligned with what you want to do.
Do you have anything to add, Kari?
I was thinking more just of an example. There's a cultural group in Calgary, the Jingwo Cultural Association, and they do the traditional lion dance, the martial arts kind of training behind the dance, and they offer classes for free, which is amazing, and so if there's somebody out there who's, like we were talking about, being an advocate it comes in many forms, but if you've got, you want to donate to groups, like seek out groups that are doing this important work, and because I can't believe that they do that. I mean, there's been kind of a revival of this, and I think they're so busy now, and I see them at so many of the cultural events in Calgary, year round too, not just at the Lunar New Year. So it was just more of an example of aligning yourself, as Barbara had said, with organizations that are doing work that you can get behind, and then maybe there's a place for you or your voice in that, or maybe you meet that network of people that can kind of come together and collaborate and have a bigger impact as a consolidated group of people. So yeah, I think the networks are out there. I think all of us are out here kind of doing our thing, and I've been so amazed and surprised, and I have to give credit to Vicky, who's on this call, and as a participant, for introducing me to a number of the people in this network, directly or indirectly. And it's just so amazing to realize how many people are out there doing this work. Because when I was in my little corner of the world, especially as a visual artist, I'm on my own, and I didn't know that, and so I've really heartened to know about all the work that you're both doing, and so many more people.
Amazing. I really echo both of you, and especially what Barbara said, having worked in the nonprofit sector for a very long time, funders don't like it when you write advocacy into your funding proposals. And so the guidance is always, let's do public education, right?
Yes.
That's the language, right? How does that, and then there's a question here, does advocacy and doing public outreach work make funders uncomfortable? Yes, it does, because you're challenging the colonial system. You're disrupting the way that people just want their widgets responded to in the funding application, right? So actually, there's this sorry.
No, finish.
Yeah, there's this really amazing organization in the States. I was just part of this BIPOC leadership circle in California, and they came and spoke to us. They're called NAVEL, NAVEL, and they've actually created a whole funding regime where they're choosing how they want to be with funders and who they want to reject. And it comes back to that piece about drawing boundaries, setting clear expectations about how to thrive rather than surviving, and negotiating on terms about what feels right for them as an organization moving forward. And it's mostly connected to the Latin American population and inner city arts, where there's a lot of balance. So it was really inspiring to see how they have built their capacity to really build a unique funding stream, and other resources to really advocate for what they need for their community and not fit into the typical box or the stereotypes that people are saying that they need, right? So that to me was really inspiring model of advocacy. Barbara, sorry, you were going to say?
No, I just wanted to answer that question. It's funny because advocacy is palatable to the funders, but activism, I would say, is not. So one of the things that we really had to talk about, or racial equity screen officer seen, I think, I don't know, was seen maybe on that spectrum more towards activism, where we were saying we're advocates for racial equity. And how can you say no to advocate for racial equity, right? So you have to put in the language that is palpable to them. One of the things at Rezo, one of the core values at Rezo is that we are trying to shift the mindset from scarcity to abundance. And what does that mean? That means we are going to shift it to abundance through collaboration. That is the only way. And that artists, and especially racialized artists, have been sort of in this scarcity mindset where we are fighting each other for these limited dollars, and that we have to think of ways to have other opportunities, create other business opportunities, create other ways to work together, so that we are, there's an abundance of opportunities. We're a small country, but we can look to the world because the racialized diaspora is large. And so we have to think about that. And if we have a vision, and we always talk about, we have to aspire to inspire. You have to look at big picture and really big ideas, so that you can inspire the next generation to work towards those big ideas. If you are thinking about things that are already can be achieved, you're not going to make the difference or make the changes that you want. So that's what I would probably leave with, is to think about how we all work together to move towards abundance.
I love that. And I think that, like, sort of dreamscaping, that foresight, that future thought, like, there's so much space for that now, right? Whereas I feel like when I was starting with this work, it was really, like you said, immediate and urgent. There was really no space for that. So that's beautiful. I'm just going to quickly read this last piece in the chat, or sorry, the Q&A. Thanks so much for sharing your experiences, especially in the Asian communities where knowledge is sometimes kept secret, or we're kind of put into these moral minority roles, and not to cause trouble. Have you ever had experiences running into elders, gatekeepers in the community that kind of bars the kind of advocacy work that you are working towards, and how do you navigate that?
I get it all the time. Oh, nothing will change. I've seen this done 100 times. Nothing will change. Well, it has changed. I mean, my life, what I experienced when I was in high school, is very different than what my kids are experiencing. The world has changed. I think knowledge knowledge is out there. They're not just keepers. You can find knowledge if you seek it. The keepers and the holders of knowledge, it's not as tight-fisted as it used to be, because of the internet, because the way information is. There's always a third door. I talk about the third door. People have said to me many times, you'll never do that, and yet I do, because there are people willing to help you make change. There are people, you just have to find them. I wouldn't have been able to do and survive all these years if there weren't people that were willing to help me. Because it's a village. It takes a village to get any of this done. And they might not want to do a lot. They can do a little, and then somebody else will do a little. But it all adds up.
Absolutely. I think I would speak to that from a more personal point of view, where when I first started doing my artworks, because I was using family photographs, it was really, my family was very uncomfortable with that, right? And particularly my dad, because he is, there were images of him as a young boy when he first got to Canada, and kind of like, in like a cowboy hat leaning against a truck, like those weird moments of assimilation. And, the gatekeepers, I think, for me early on were the elders in my family, where it's like, oh, we don't talk about that, or there was never a clear answer to the questions, or there wasn't really a sharing of these things, right? Or even when I expressed about that project I was part of for July 1st this year, and a number of the people that were approached at first didn't want to be a part of it, and that included my parents, because both sides of my family were impacted by the Exclusion Act. But they came around, actually, because a couple of other people talked to them, and they both actually came and participated in the interviews, which, by the way, were entered into the City of Calgary archives, because we were also talking about that, right, in terms of like gathering those stories and having them on public record, right? So that was amazing. And then, you know, as I went on with this series of work, because I've been working on these pieces for 25 years, it got to a point where my dad was actually helping me to source materials for these pieces, right? And so, you know, on that kind of personal level, it kind of transformed. And so, and I think that that could be applied to, you know, more community level activity, right? So anyways, that was, yeah, and that work really helped me to repair my relationship with my dad. So that was kind of amazing. And the stories did come out eventually, and it keeps going. Yeah.
I love that. And you know, I feel the same way as all of you, because right now I'm in a situation where my parents' generation is passing on, right? So all the stories that you want to document, to hold, to pass on, because they are Alberta stories, they are Edmonton stories, they happen here, they haven't happened anywhere else, are important to preserve. So I think sometimes um, you need to build that relationship of connecting as well and being patient, because
Yes. Yeah.
it takes a long time for people to be vulnerable. So how do we be patient with that, right? This was such a lovely discussion. Thank you to you both. I'm so blessed to have this day and time with you. We'll just wrap up now. I think it's 7:15. Maybe we could like end with sort of like, I like that what you said, Barbara, about your action. What is your action? So you shared yours. Carrie, do you have one to share?
I think, well, I think in terms of my next level of projects, I have done public works where I've worked to gather community stories, and then those are integrated into public artworks. But there hasn't been one that's specific to, you know, the Asian or Chinese Canadian community. And so, you know, I have it in my mind to kind of work towards that. And so I'm just saying that out loud because now it's out there in the world. But, you know, and in that journey, just like sharing and discovering more stories, because I think that's what brings us together. So, yeah. How about
Well,
you,
you know,
Soni?
the Vancouver, there's a Chinese Canadian museum that just opened up in Vancouver, and maybe that's what we need is your project to be an installation there.
Okay, I'm gonna check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Connecting.
yeah,
Exactly, right? Yeah.
I think that's the thing. I think like that's the piece. Like I feel like how can we, as part of this Can Asian network, connect to create more projects, more abundance, more spaces for discussion, more opportunities to do like work like you're saying, Carrie. Like I would love to collaborate with you on something Albertan, because we always get the short stick. Right? I feel like everything's like Alberta is this thing. No, 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 it's not that, right? So
We're looking for board members from across Canada.
Okay.
but yeah, like sharing the wealth, right? Sharing the knowledge, sharing the love. I love that. So to me, that's also how advocacy carries on, because we're all passionate. We all want to make a change. We all want to make a difference. So like that small step, what is it? So yeah, so thanks so much. This is lovely. I hope you all have a good evening, and thank you, Sean, for introducing us, and Miranda for organizing this particular panel. It was great to meet both of you. I don't know you before, but I feel like I know you now. So
Yes, yes.
Thank
yeah,
you.
so good night, everyone. I hope you had a really great opportunity to listen to our voices, to our stories, to what advocacy and community care can look like, and have some examples that you can share in your inquiry box to build your capacity to explore advocacy or to build your advocacy practice. So good night, and see you later.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.